Hello, everyone. Today we're going to talk about the era of good feelings, a time period that spans from 1816 to 1824. Today's objective question is, what were the major characteristics of the era of good feelings? So, by the time the election of 1816 rolls around, James Madison is just finishing up his second term. Remember, he's the fourth president of the United States. Remember that he's a Democratic Republican. And he's going to step down after his second term because that was the precedent set by George Washington, and that's kind of, seen as the thing to do. So what we need to do is elect a new president. And in the election of 1816, we have two men going against one another. The first is this man right here, James Monroe. He is selected by the Democratic Republicans. He is once again from Virginia, as James Madison and others were as well. And he is going to be facing the Federalist candidate, this guy. This is a Federalist named Rufus King. And I'm not saying it's a popularity contest, but there's a clear winner here. And the people of 1816 agree with me. If we look at the election results here, all of these states that are green are those who went with James Monroe, are the Democratic Republicans. Up here in the Northeast right here, we see a couple people who went for the Federalists, but for the most part, the Democratic Republicans easily win the election of 1816, and James Monroe becomes president. Now, this was kind of easy for him to do because, as we talked about yesterday, the Federalists are becoming extremely unpopular. In the election of 1816, Monroe's complete annihilation of the Federalist Party is going to mark the end of the Federalist Party. And the Federalists had a couple things working against them leading up to this. The first was the Hartford Convention. We mentioned this last week, where a bunch of the Federalists got together during the War of 1812. Like, people are fighting, people are dying, the war is on. And the Federalists have a convention in Hartford, Connecticut, and just whine and complain about how much the Democratic Republicans are mean and how they wish things were different. This comes off as a very bad look for the Federalists. It makes them look disloyal. It makes them look unpatriotic, and that was a huge hit against them. Other issues the Federalists have is that they're very, very focused on New England issues only. And if we go back to this map real quick, we can see this, right? Majority of Federalist states are up here in this region here, and that's because they're the ones who support the things that are good for that region only, which makes it hard to identify for anybody else why we would go with them. And lastly, the hard lines that were drawn in the sand before between Democratic Republicans and Federalists have started to kind of blur. And that really kicked off with Jefferson specifically, where Democratic Republicans such as Jefferson were borrowing aspects from the Federalist Party that at first they really didn't like. And then when it became, useful for them, they started to borrow. So Hamilton's financial plan, the bank, that was a really important aspect of our government that we needed, and the Democratic Republicans came to accept that. Expansion, growing our country, the Louisiana Purchase. And with that, of course, is the loose interpretation of the Constitution that was essential for the Democratic Republicans to utilize during certain time periods, specifically the Louisiana Purchase. And this is these are clear Federalist opinions, which shows that we're trying to, instead of having two extremes, we're starting to get closer and closer to the middle. One of the reasons the era of good feelings is called the era of good feelings is because literally everybody's getting along because there's literally only one political party. And that's the Democratic Republicans that you could argue are a little bit more Federalist than they used to be. So, back to Monroe. James Monroe, here he is. He is the fifth president. He is going to continue what we refer to as the Virginia dynasty. We refer to the first couple of presidents as the Virginia dynasty because 4 out of the first 5 presidents came from Virginia. We had Washington, Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe. John Adams is the only man coming from Massachusetts that didn't come from Virginia. So he's going to continue that trend. He's also going to do a great job picking people for government positions from different areas, from different political parties, from different regions, and kind of give him a better sense of what's going on throughout the country, which is a great thing to do. Also, fresh off the War of 1812, the victory, and I put those in quotations, right? The kind of victory that we had in the War of 1812, one of the major effects of that is the rise in nationalism, and Monroe's riding that. Instead of it being about, political boundaries and lines, political parties, or regional lines, instead, for this really short time period, the era of good feelings, it's more about being an American than anything else, and that's going to be really nice for the United States. Upon winning, Monroe is going to do a tour around the United States. He's going to go to different regions of the country and kind of see firsthand what the South is like, what the West is like, what the frontier is like, and get a better understanding of how he can serve those areas. So, pretty cool. Now, of course, he has to select his cabinet. So for Secretary of War, he goes with Calhoun. Remember, we've talked about Calhoun. Calhoun was that war hawk who pushed for the War of 1812. Calhoun was the guy who I told you always looks like a villain or a vampire. He kind of looks like both in this picture. All right, so John C. Calhoun is selected as Secretary of War. Secretary of Treasury goes to a man named Crawford. More on him later. And Secretary of State, remember that really, really important position, goes to a man named John Quincy Adams. More on him in just a second. Now, the reason I show you these positions, right, is because this causes some major drama. And the drama it kind of, folds around is Henry Clay. Remember him? I told you he was like the Hamilton of this unit. He's in everything. His hands are absolutely in every single piece of whatever's going on, right? And here's some drama for you, okay? Henry Clay. Very powerful politician at this point. He's the Speaker of the House. Very powerful, very influential. Now, was James Monroe going to beat Rufus King? Absolutely. Was he necessarily going to get the nomination for the Democratic nominee? Not really without Henry Clay's help. So you can totally argue, and Henry Clay does, argue that Monroe is president because Henry Clay put his support behind him and literally helped him get elected. So Henry Clay is saying, ooh, can't wait to get a nice, cushy job. And Monroe says, Henry Clay, you're great. You're one of those war hawks that I love. Why don't you become Secretary of War? And Henry Clay goes, no, I don't want to be Secretary of War. Henry Clay says, I want to be Secretary of State. Remember, if we've learned anything from looking at these previous presidencies, it's that the Secretary of State almost always becomes president. And that's what Henry Clay wants more than anything else. He wants to become president, so he wants to be the Secretary of State. But James Monroe was afraid that if he gave him this position, if he gave Henry Clay Secretary of State, it would look like he was playing favorites. It would look like he was basically, completing a bribe, and he didn't want to do that. And James Monroe says, I'm sorry, I can't give you that, but you can be the Secretary of War. And Henry Clay says, if I'm not Secretary of State, I don't want anything. And James Monroe says, okay, you're nothing. Henry Clay is skeething mad. He is angry. And this will come into play later. So just file that away. Henry Clay is really mad. John Quincy Adams, of course, is the man that James Monroe selects. John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams, the second president of the United States. John Quincy Adams, he is small, he's compact, he's angry, and he's sassy. Sometimes referred to as a bulldog among spaniels, John Quincy Adams is quick to defend himself if he feels like he needs to, and he's a very, very feisty individual. More on him in a little bit. Now, some key events that are going to occur in the era of good feelings. We're going to get through some of them today. The Convention of 1818, the Seminole Wars, the Adams-Onis Treaty, the Treaty of Multi Creek, the American System, and the Panic of 1819. Let's get started. The Convention of 1818, very, very simply. This is going to be a treaty between the United States and England. So Canada, of course, is controlled by England at this point. The Convention of 1818 has two elements. The first is that we're going to draw a straight line between the United States and Canada. Prior to this treaty, we used these boundary lines that were based on waterways, and it's really, really hard to keep track of whose land is whose, how far it goes, and all that stuff. Instead, we're going to draw a straight line, right? So that's the first part. Second part of this treaty is this area right here that's in yellow, the Oregon country, is full of Americans and Canadians and English people. We haven't exactly claimed, either one of those countries claimed this area for sure. And what this treaty basically says is, we can just kind of share it for now, and in 10 years we'll figure it out. So the Convention of 1818, a straight line border up until you get to this area, and we're just going to share that area for now. Here's some more details if you want to get into it, but for now that's all we need to know. The Seminole Wars, another awesome thing that we simply just don't have time to get super, super deep into. 1816 to 1819. Florida at this point is controlled by Spain. All right. Spain used to have Florida and then kind of gave it to England and then took it back. And so now, anyway, long story short, Spain controls Florida. And Florida is seen as a safe haven for escaped slaves because they know that if they escape and get to Florida, the Americans can't bring them back. So they're fleeing to Florida. And also Native Americans are fleeing American control by going to Florida. So we have escaped slaves and Native Americans in Florida. And then these escaped slaves and Native Americans are raiding Americans on the southern border of the United States, specifically in Georgia. So that's really kind of rubbing a lot of us the wrong way. We need that to end. So Andrew Jackson is going to be sent down into Florida. He's going to attack both based on, orders and also kind of based on his own volition. He starts rampaging around and attacking people. And very long story short there, a bunch of people get mad. Spain's kind of angry about it. But at the end, Spain says, okay, fine, you can have Florida. We kind of don't even want it anymore. And some people were mad at Andrew Jackson for invading when he wasn't supposed to. Everyone else was kind of like, we got Florida though, right? And that brings us to the Adams-Onis Treaty, which is kind of an extension of the Seminole Wars. It's kind of the end of that. This is the treaty that's going to end these wars and officially give Florida to the United States. So the Adams-Onis Treaty gives Florida to the United States, and it creates this little staircase divider thing between all of New Spain, all of Spain possessions in the New World, and also the United States. So it's going to, 1, give us Florida, and 2, give us this staircase division line. Okay, so that's the first part. Although it took over 2 years for the Adams-Onis Treaty to officially be, hammered out, detailed, and signed, it's only in effect for 183 days because shortly after we sign it, Spain actually gives independence to Mexico. And now instead of all of this being Spanish controlled, it's now Mexican controlled. And what we need to do is make sure we sign another treaty that has that exact same boundary with the Mexicans. And that's exactly what we do. And we rename it the Treaty of Limits. So the Adams-Onis Treaty between us and Spain is renamed the Treaty of Limits between us and Mexico. And now we have Florida and the staircase dividing line between our country and there. Adams-Onis, of course, because John Quincy Adams, the Secretary of State, is going to argue for that, us, and Onis because that's one of the Spanish ambassadors between us. The Treaty of Multi Creek, and I know I'm going really fast, but I've got a time limit, right? So we're trying to get through everything. The Treaty of Multi Creek, very, very simply, now that we have Florida, we want to get into it. The Treaty of Multi Creek simply says that all the Native Americans who live in North Florida have to scooch down to the center of Florida, and we're going to place them on reservations there so we can control them, and so the Americans can move in and start to utilize the northern part of Florida. We're going to enforce this by building forts and literally physically making sure they're where they're supposed to be. And then that leads us to this. This is the United States right here, about halfway through the era of good feelings. All this pink kind of salmon color is owned by the United States, including Florida now. We have this neat little staircase dividing line that divides us and at first Spain, but then later Mexico. And then we've got this blurred area right here called Oregon country that we share with Great Britain or England at this point. That will change, of course, later, but for now, those are the treaties, and that's how our country looks at this point. It's a lot of treaties all at once, so they do get a little bit confusing, but Adam's onus is probably the one you'll be most experienced with towards the end of this. All right, make sure to answer your objective question, and I'll see you guys later. Bye-bye.